Welcome to another episode of the Michael Yardney podcast. As somebody who's interested in real estate, you'd know that a property's value is typically divided into two components, the land component and the value of any improvements, such as the dwellings. Now, conventionally, land tends to appreciate over time, while buildings are said to depreciate as they get older and suffer more wear and tear. However, the rise in construction costs that we've experienced over the last couple of years poses an interesting question. What impact does this have? For instance, the average cost to construct a house has surged almost 30% over the last couple of years, and the cost of constructing apartments has skyrocketed even more. So when the cost to replace the dwelling significantly outpaces depreciation, how does this impact on your property investments? Well, my guest today, independent financial analyst Stuart Wemyss, Director of Pro Solution Private Clients, recently wrote a blog with some suggestions, and that's what I want to discuss with him today. As usual, Stuart offers some great insights, so wherever you are on your investment journey, I think you're going to get some benefit. So let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Stuart, great to have you back again.
Thanks, Michael. Always enjoy our chats.
Now, Stuart, you recently wrote a blog on your Pro Solution website and you discussed it in your Investopoly podcast, which I listen to every Wednesday when it comes out, where you looked at the rising cost of construction and what that means for the property investment equation. Now, I'd like to dig into that in a moment, but maybe if I could first set the scene. Currently, there's a significant undersupply of properties for our booming population growth. We know the government's been talking about a whole lot of ideas. It's got this undertaking now to deliver 1.2 million new dwellings over the next 5 years. I don't think that's going to happen. Of course, most commentators realise it's not going to happen, especially when you're talking about what they mentioned, affordable housing, as the cost to build new houses in Australia, new dwellings, has surged over the last years, driven by massive supply shortages, trade shortages. And even though the cost seems to be coming down a little bit, the rising cost seems to be coming down a bit, the cost of dwellings is going up. At the same time, more builders are going broke, causing builders to place hefty margins on any new contracts to make sure they remain solvent. So now we know that a property's values, I guess it's typically made up of two bits, Stuart, the land value and the value of the improvements, the dwelling. Conventionally, land appreciates, while over the past, I guess, buildings depreciated. They got older, they suffered wear and tear. But what's happening now with this huge rise, skyrocketing rise in construction costs? What impact will that have on our property investments, Stuart?
Well, firstly, Michael, I've got to credit you with the idea around this blog that I wrote, because it's something that you and I have spoken about, you know, at length in terms of building versus land value, and the fact that in your personal and professional experience that, you know, the cost to rebuild a particular property has increased over time. Anyway, so I've been thinking about our conversations, and then it made me do a bit of research, and I was actually really surprised about what I found. I looked at the House Construction Input Index, which the Australian Bureau of Statistics put together and has published since 1966. There's many decades of data there. And I found two things. The first one that surprised me the most is that really since 1966, construction costs have increased by about 5%.
Per annum each year. Yeah.
Yep, correct. Which is probably about 2.5% more than inflation, because inflation's been around about 2.5%, 2 to 3% over that time. So in real terms, the cost of housing is actually increasing every year. And I would have thought, my gut feeling would be it would just move in line, relatively in line with inflation, but it's really moving at twice the pace of inflation. And the second observation was over the last 2 years, the cost to construct a dwelling per this index has increased by 30%, But I'm sure you would know that on a per square metre basis, in many cases, it's actually increased by more than that. So
Well, you're talking about normal dwellings, but if we talk about apartments, the cost of medium density and especially high-rise apartments has gone up closer to 50% according to some of the quantity surveyors over the last 3 years since COVID. It's also related to the fact that nowadays anything new being built has got lots more regulations and they've got to build them, I guess, more carefully so we don't have more opal towers and mascot towers and those sort of problems. But there's also insulation, thermal quality. So it actually costs a lot more to build than it used to. You're right.
yeah, and perhaps my stupid and simplistic way of thinking was previously really, as you sort of mentioned in your opening, land appreciates, buildings do depreciate, which is true. I mean, they do depreciate over time with wear and tear, but we have to consider the cost to replace. Even if it's the cost to replace a 10-year-old dwelling, it's still going to be impacted by the fact that, if I had to rebuild this dwelling and even taking into account the wear and tear over the last 10 years, the cost to rebuild it is probably more than what it cost 10 years ago because of these rising construction costs. So I was really surprised that since 1966, it's 5.32% compounding annual growth in terms of construction costs.
So I guess for tax reasons, you can actually depreciate the dwelling and the fittings, and that requires a quantity surveyor's report because they're done at different levels. The real value of your dwelling doesn't depreciate as much. Sure, a 10-year-old dwelling hasn't got the same value as a brand new one, but I guess that's got to be taken into account. So from an investor's point of view, should rising construction costs influence the type of dwelling they're looking at, Stuart?
Well, I think we look at the sort of components of return. So if we say that let's just say that the dwelling is actually appreciating by 5% per annum, we have to realise that we still have to spend a bit of money on a dwelling each year to maintain it to standard. You're never going to maintain it to the standard where it's brand new, never been lived in. Of course, you're always going to have the natural wear and tear, but you need to make sure that it's in good tenantable order and it's well functioning and so forth. And we all must understand that with property maintenance, you can never avoid it. You can delay it. You can kick the can down the road, but you're always going to have to pay what it costs. So you either spend the $5,000 today, or if you don't do it for another 5 years, it might cost you $10,000 to fix whatever the problem is, but you can never really avoid it. And so maybe we're spending, somewhere around about 1.5% of the building value on maintenance, just roughly and it can be different for different properties and different age of properties and those sorts of things. So we can't just look at that headline growth and go, well, the building value is going to appreciate by 5%. Of course, we need to put some money into it. But really, if we've got a property, when we look at the long-term average growth of the median house price in most capital city markets is between around about 7.5% long-term since 1980. To achieve a growth rate of 7.5%, and if we assume that the building value is growing at, let's say 3% net of the amount that we're spending on it, then what that means is that underlying land value must be growing at a rate around 10% to achieve an overall growth rate of 7%, because obviously only part's land and the other part is building. So really, when you look at the components of return, you've got one returning maybe 3-ish% plus or minus a couple of percent, and the land portion's generating 10% growth rate. So it tells me that if I'm going to go and spend money on an investment, I'll probably contribute most of my money towards the land value of that investment because I'm getting a 10% return. Whereas if I buy too much building value, so I buy a brand new building, for example, a brand new property, newly constructed property, I'm probably spending more than 50% of the purchase price on the building value. And whilst that rising construction costs might mean that building value is rising, it's certainly not rising by as much as the underlying land value, assuming it's in a good quality location. So I think the thesis that buildings depreciate, land appreciates isn't maybe perfectly correct, but it doesn't really change the approach. The approach is buy something that's very land heavy in a good location where there's always going to be excess demand over supply, and that's likely to generate the highest investment return over the long run.
Well, I think we've always both agreed that it's really important to have a high land to asset ratio. And let's make it clear, that doesn't mean a big block of land. I'd rather have a tenth of a block of land in an apartment in Bondi overlooking the water and overlooking the beach than a couple of acres in the middle of Alice Springs or Darwin. So apartments do have an attributable land value. Having said that, if you buy one of those new apartments where it does cost a lot more today than to build a couple of years ago, you've got 1/200th or 1/300th of a block of land, and there isn't really much land to asset ratio there. So I think there's a number of different things to take into account. If you're buying something new, you usually, in most cases, also paying a premium, aren't you, Stuart? There are marketers and other costs in the middle. Too many fingers in the pie.
Yeah, and you don't really know what the property's worth. You know what the developer wants to sell it to you for, but it's never traded on the open market. And so you really don't know what it's worth. And it's interesting discussion that you hear at the moment, like the build to rent sort of market,
yes.
And how their approach and the developers kind of admitting their approach is completely different for that type of asset. So build to rent means that the some sort of institution or whatever will continue to own the property after it's been constructed and then rent it out to residential tenants. In that regard, the cost to construct a property like that is a lot more than, say, a build to sell style asset. The developer's only interested in one transaction, and that is complete the building and then sell the asset. They're not really interested on how that building performs longer term. So I think it's a good example and a good conversation that's going on at the moment that sort of educates people, hey, developers that build these towers that kind of flog off these apartments, maybe you're not actually getting a really good, a well-constructed property as a result.
My sense is that most Australians recognise that now, and they're not selling many off-the-plan apartments. Last big building boom, many of those were foreign investors, and we're not getting as many of those now, even though they're coming back again, and maybe we're going to need them to help support the pre-sales to get more towers out of the ground. But, and we've discussed it privately, that my approach has been to buy great land close to areas that are in gentrifying suburbs and pull down the old house and build 2 townhouses. And so therefore, yes, there's a large amount of dwelling, and yes, it does depreciate over time, but the underlying premise is that should still be in areas where there's scarcity, in established areas, in gentrifying areas where people moving in have got more money, and young people are improving the areas. I guess there's also the question then, renovation. When should you get involved in renovating and improving your property? And I think, like any other business in your property business, you've got to keep your investment property up to scratch, and it is worthwhile putting some money in to renovate your property, Stuart.
Yeah, I mean, regular maintenance is necessary. If you're not prepared to do that, there's a cost. Whilst you might say, oh, look, I'm not going to spend money on maintenance and I've saved that money, what you're really probably doing, the result of that saving is that you're not optimizing the rental yield, so the income that the property is generating, and also you're not keeping up with the what is expected from purchases in that area as well. So the valuation or market value of your property will also suffer as well. So we've got to be prepared to invest some time in maintenance. But in terms of renovation or improvements to the property, again, it's really just about return on capital, and it's just a very easy decision. So whilst my personal professional focus is, if we're going to go and buy a property, I would like to put most of my money in land. That's fine for the initial purchase. But in terms of managing that asset ongoing, I'm very open to making improvements to the property if it makes sense. So I'll give you an example. My wife and I bought a property in Brisbane a couple of years ago. I think the actual dwelling is in terrible order, but the tenants, when we bought the property, it had tenants in it, and those tenants had been there for years, and the rental income, the yield was terrible. It's like $400 a week or something like that. And I think the land value proportion would be more than 80%. Like, the dwelling is actually not worth very much. Anyway, those tenants are moving out. We're planning to spend about $90,000 on, things like painting, carpet, blinds, very, very cosmetic stuff, maybe updating the kitchen a little bit. And the projected rental will increase from $400 to maybe $700 a week. So we're spending $90,000 and getting about a $15,000 income return on that, or 17%. Well, it's a bit of a no-brainer, isn't it?
Well, that's pretty good.
Borrow the money, 6.5%, I'm still well ahead on percentage terms. And the fact is that you can fund those renovations through additional borrowings. You don't actually have to outlay the cash. You just got to outlay the additional interest cost, which is tax deductible. And I've worked out on an after-tax basis, just from completing those renovations, I'm $8,000 a year better off after tax. So it's a no-brainer, right? It enhances my cash flow, it enhances the property value, and it minimises any vacancy risk as well. And so,
but that's because you bought in the right location too.
Bought in the right location, spent most of my money on land, but then also, I guess, what we're kind of contradicting ourselves to some degree, because I think it's fine to spend money on building value, but do it after you've bought the property, not before. Don't pay someone else to improve your property, because you're sort of, as you say, you want to manufacture equity. You want to manufacture that equity. Don't let someone else manufacture it, and then you pay them for that.
And of course, the aim of that is not to flip it and make a profit, because by the time you pay all the costs and capital gains tax, there's nothing in it. I'm getting a lot of blogs at the moment in my inbox talking about, hey, you don't even need money to get into property at the moment, Stuart. I'm sorry, I don't know if you knew that or not. I mean, you're a veteran of this, but you don't need money. You just buy a property, do it up and flip it. Yeah. So let's talk about location just briefly, because we said that land value is important, but not all land's created equal. And it's a little bit, in my mind, like monopoly. Everyone wants to buy Mayfair, the most expensive treats, and no one buys or wants to buy those cheap properties at the other end of the board. I don't even remember the names there. I think they're purple there. So it's like in real life too. There's discretionary locations. These are often the most expensive suburbs in our capital cities, the established money locations where residents have lived for a long time. They've paid off their mortgages. They generally don't fluctuate in value as much, but because they're tightly held. Think of Toorak, Brighton, Kew in Victoria, Tenerife and New Farm in Brisbane, Darling Point, Bellevue Hill in Sydney. And they're the higher end, more affluent locations. I'm not necessarily sure they're the best ones to invest in, even though the land is probably the most valuable price per square metre. I like investing in aspirational locations. They're the upper middle class. They're the gentrifying suburbs like Bentley, Elwood, Melbourne, Paddington, Mosman, Randwick, Newtown in Sydney, Camphill, Grange in Brisbane. They're suburbs where the many affluent millennials are aspiring to move and enter. They're entering their family formation stage. They're doing up homes like you'd just done. They're moving into new townhouses like we're building, but we don't sell them. And this wealthier demographic tends to push up property values. And then there are, I guess, there are four groups of suburbs, different sorts of land. I've talked about the expensive, more discretionary locations, the aspirational locations I like. A lot of people talk about buying in affordable locations. I'm not sure I totally agree with that. That's where many homeowners, investors look, because they can afford to buy. They've been advised to buy there because properties are cheap. And some have got good locations, but they're not going to gentrify quickly. And then there are, I guess, the last choice locations in every state. There are areas where people live not because they want to. They don't wake up in the morning saying they want to live there. They've got no choice. Of course, you then got to buy the right property in that location, an A-grade property or an home or investment-grade property. But I just wanted to clarify that, yes, we're saying land is king, but not all land's created equal, just like on the Monopoly board, Stuart.
No, and spot on, Michael, and that's really, there's that term, you make your profit when you buy, and I don't know if I completely agree with it, but really the theme is that asset selection is key, and I certainly 100% agree with that. So you can never change the land, you can never change where it is, the amount you have, the orientation, but you can always change the building. So don't worry so much about the building. I'm not saying totally ignore it, but really most of your energy should be, how can I invest in the highest quality land that my budget will allow, and then go and spend as much as possible of that budget on the underlying land, because we know that we can change the dwelling. In fact, maybe a redevelopment at sometimes has a lot of merit as well. I mean, you've advised lots of clients in regards to that and produced some fantastic results. So even if I use that property that I was talking about in Brisbane that my wife and I own, It happens to be on 2 separate titles, although planning restrictions don't allow you to build, I think, 2 dwellings at this stage on that asset. But really, our intention was more of a bit of land banking. To buy this property, it's mostly land in 20 years' time, but it'll be worth a hell of a lot more than what it is today, which I'm convinced of. But if the Brisbane City Council changes those planning regulations because it's on such a 850 square metre block, it's kind of not very useful from a density perspective. And I imagine there'll be more and more pressure, growing pressure. There already is on councils to allow greater sort of density and development in that area.
Well, that's what all the government talk fest was about, wasn't it?
Exactly right. Well, maybe they'll turn around one day and say, you know what, now you've got these 2 titles, you can put a dwelling on each title. If that occurs, I haven't done the numbers. I'm sure the numbers will prove that bulldozing that dwelling and building, 2 family homes or 2 townhouses or whatever it might be on that location makes sense as well. And remember, we can get the depreciation if they changed those rules a few years ago. But if you actually spend the money on the improvements or rebuilding a property, you can get the depreciation as well, which certainly helps the cash flow. And again, it's really then just a difference between the depreciation, the rent that you get, and the interest costs associated with it. And quite often, it can sort of self-fund itself in terms of those improvements. So I think spending money on building value is fine, but just do it after the purchase.
That makes sense. Well, clearly people listening to this understand a pick that you've got a depth of knowledge, not just about property, but about tax and finance, and that's how you help your clients at Pro Solution. So maybe you could just quickly explain what you do at Pro Solution and how you help your clients.
So we believe, Michael, that a lot of financial decisions, in fact, most financial decisions are multifaceted in that you need to take into account tax, cash flow, borrowing capacity, financial planning, retirement, super, there's a lot of far-reaching consequences of maybe just one decision. And investing in property is a perfect example of that. You've got to think about cash flow, you've got to think about financial planning, borrowing capacity, tax, all those sorts of things. So we like to inspire our clients to adopt a holistic approach in attacking those decisions and really building a holistic team. And that's exactly what we're able to provide at Pro Solution, so we can get to understand our clients' financial position, their goals, and that way we can workshop the best way to help them to achieve those goals.
Okay, well, I'll leave a link to Pro Solution in the show notes, as well as to your weekly Investopoly podcast and your blog as well. Stuart, thanks a lot. I guess the conclusion really is that despite the fact that construction costs have surged, they're going to be normalising now. It's really the underlying land value that remains the primary driver of long-term growth of your property, and location is critical in that as well. So look forward to catching up with you again next month, Stuart.
Thanks, Michael. It's been fun as always.
I hope you got some benefit from my chat with Stuart Wemyss, and we get together once a month to talk about property. If you enjoyed it but don't currently follow or subscribe to this show, before we go on to the next segment, just stop for a sec and click on whatever buttons are there on your podcast app at the moment and follow us, subscribe as some podcast apps call it, so that twice a week you're going to get the benefit from my guests. And by the way, I'll leave a link in the show notes. You can also get a special thank you from me for following the show, a pack of ebooks and reports. Just go to podcastbonus.com.au and I'd be happy to share those with you. Now, in a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you. That's always very popular as I discuss some of the psychology of success that helps some people become better investors than others. But beforehand, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the current property markets, because I know a lot of people currently are confused. They're wondering what they should do at this, well, let's call it interesting phase of the property cycle. If you're like many investors or potential investors, you're probably wondering, what's the right thing to do? Should you buy? Should you sell? Should you just wait? What's happening at the moment? Like it or not, we've moved to the next phase of the property cycle. Property values are rising still, but not as fast. There's also lots of government and political and economic issues ahead of us. Now, it's not too late to invest in this new property cycle, but you must be strategic. By the way, it's always important to be strategic. So you should really stress test your investment strategies. And at Metropole, that's an area that our strategic property plan does. We also review any current portfolio that you've got, and we make sure you've got the right finance structures and give you the opportunity to take advantage of the market if it's right for you. So rather than trying to do it on your own, why not use the time-tested strategies that I've used, the frameworks I've fine-tuned over 5 decades and we've been helping clients with for over 20 years. The team at Metropole are much more than just buyer's agents. We help you safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. We've got buyer's agency, sure, but first of all, we help you put a plan together, but you could also use our property management, our renovations, our development service, wealth advisory, financial planning, and of course, Mastermind for Business with Mark Creedon. Go to metropole.com.au. We've been successfully investing through 6 property cycles. Why not take advantage of that experience?
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message for you today, I'd like to talk a bit about it. I guess it's the sort of law of attraction. What you think about the most is what you get. I mean, we often hear that mindset is everything, but how many of us genuinely heed this wisdom? We let our thoughts wander aimlessly, sometimes in hopeful directions, but often in the abyss of fear, of anger, of resentment. So what's the truth? Well, what you think about the most is what you will attract in your life. Yes, that's right. The law of attraction isn't just some new age mumbo jumbo. It actually is the real deal. Now, it's more than just thinking about things, but you will attract things into your life because of the way your reticular activating system works. I've spoken about that before. But if you're scared of failure, humiliation, or judgment, you're not alone. But here's the kicker. If you're afraid, then all the goblins that you fear about will be attracted to you. The only useful purpose of fear is to remind you to plan. Plan so you can protect yourself from harm. But don't become timid because of it. If you're using fear to stop yourself from taking action, then you've got it the wrong way around. That's not caution, that's paralysis. And a paralyzed life isn't a life fully lived, is it? It's a trade-off. In fact, it's a terrible one at that. Similarly, anger begets anger. Anger's contagious. An angry mind attracts more hostility than a magnet attracts iron. So before you know it, your world is a cacophony of honking horns, raised voices, and endless conflict. Now that's a waste of energy. Don't get caught in this draining cycle. It's a good idea to choose your habitual thought patterns carefully. On the other hand, there's the power of a positive mindset. I don't know, have you noticed how some people seem to have everything go their way? By the way, that's not an accident. Love, optimism and gratitude are not only great states of mind, but they also become self-fulfilling prophecies. They make you more approachable, create openings for opportunities, and even make the boogeyman of your life seem less daunting. And in time, the goblins and angry people will get smaller and less important, and finally they're going to fade away. They're going to go away. Now, the choice is yours. When life throws you a challenging situation, and boy, will it keep doing that. That'll never go away. When life throws you a challenging situation, you've got 2 choices. You can see it as a cosmic conspiracy against you, or you can see it just as an event, an opportunity for growth, an opportunity for change. Now, you may as well be positive. Bottom line, it works better. Positivity isn't just about feeling good, though. It's actually practical. A positive demeanour makes you easier to be around. It amplifies your creativity. Interestingly, even your immune system gets a boost. In other words, being positive is a win-win. So my suggestion in this mindset message is to challenge the status quo. Don't get tricked into thinking it's unreasonable to aim for the stars, to go big. If you think that way, that's a defeatist mindset. You've achieved the impossible before. Maybe you haven't recognised it. You learned to walk. That was once impossible. Reading. You didn't know how to do that. As you grow, your challenges evolve, but the principles remain the same. So my suggestion to you is break boundaries. Don't set them for yourself. So here's the actionable bit. Put this into practice for just 1 week. Direct your thoughts towards what you want. Embrace optimism, embrace gratitude, embrace generosity. The more you practice, the better you get. So, again, my test for you. Go ahead, test it. What have you got to lose? The only way you can fail at anything is to quit trying. Your life is a product of your thoughts, so choose them wisely. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?